Okay, hi there. Welcome back to another video where we're going to be thinking about preparation for exams. And this is an analysis and evaluation session with some application thrown in as well. Let's think about, for a few minutes, the policies that might be used to address negative externalities. I'm going to focus on negative production externalities. Let's just quickly work through the diagram. There's been lots of separate videos on this. So this is the marginal private cost and marginal private benefit. We ignore externalities in consumption here. And of course, with negative production externalities, external costs mean that the marginal social cost lies above the marginal private cost. So there's a gap between MSC and marginal private cost, MPC, and the gap is marginal external cost. The private optimum output is Q1, and that's where private cost and benefit are equal. Agents are assumed to only consider their own marginal costs and benefits, their own internal costs and benefits. But at Q1, there is an external cost. There's the private cost at Q1, there's the social cost at Q1, and the difference is the marginal external cost, which is the vertical distance between MSC and MPC. So from society's point of view, the social cost of that output is well above the private cost, and that leads to a loss of welfare. From society's point of view, we'd prefer to be at Q2, or at least we take the externalities into account. So the fact, and the price of course would be high to reflect that. So the fact that the social optimum is different to the private optimum means that there is a market failure and there's an overproduction equal to the output distance Q1 to Q2. So there's a market failure, and of course beyond output Q2, social cost is greater than any marginal social benefit. That causes social welfare to fall. So let's label those points ABC. Therefore ABC becomes the social welfare loss. The essential point is that economic agents operating in their own self-interest do not take account of the cost their decisions impose on others. The market price fails to price negative externalities properly, leading to a misallocation of scarce resources from a social perspective, and therefore you lose the welfare loss. Negative production activities are everywhere, from airlines to farmers to cement factories to manufacturing, car manufacture. Now, the main aim of government intervention is not to eliminate externalities. Yes, we can have targets for zero carbon, etc. But the aim is not to get externalities down to zero, because in a sense they're inevitable. The main aim of an intervention in the market is normally to take externalities into account so that we move towards a socially optimum equilibrium. Lots of different options for intervention, from taxes to subsidies to regulatory interventions, information policies, behavioural nudges. I think a really key point is that no single intervention on its own is likely to be sufficient. You need a mix of policies, and of course you then can calibrate which policies you think might work best. And with any government intervention, there's always the risk of government failure, which might deepen the existing market failure. When judging the effectiveness of policy, please always remember to bring into evaluation alternative policies. So if you're talking about policy A, for example, a carbon tax, you might discuss that a carbon trading scheme perhaps could be more effective, or vice versa. So thinking about negative production externalities in particular, what kind of interventions might be used? Well, here are some, and let me just go through adding a bit of application. So clearly carbon taxes and other Pigouvian taxes might be used. A Pigouvian tax is named after the economist Pigou, and it's based on what's called the polluter pays principle. The idea being that the polluter, the airline, for example, or the cement factory or the incinerator plant, should pay for some of the external costs they create. And that is known as internalising the externality, polluter pays principle. So carbon taxes are well understood. I have a separate video on them on the channel. Latest estimates, for example, suggest that for high-income countries, you probably need a carbon price of about $75 per tonne to really make a difference. Perhaps for middle-income countries, that could be down to $50 per tonne, and maybe for lower income countries, you might have a carbon tax which is less. Affordability is less, isn't it? Maybe 25 euros per tonne. So carbon taxes, key intervention. Of course, the other main alternative is, in terms of making the polluter pay, is to introduce tradable permit systems. ETS, the European Emissions Trading Scheme, has been around for just under 20 years. Again, we have separate videos on carbon trading. So if you just type 222 carbon trading into YouTube, you'll find some great stuff. Of course, the UK has now left the European Union post-Brexit, and they've brought in their own carbon emissions trading scheme, which auctions off CO2 permits. That market is not as big as the European market, and therefore prices on average are a little bit higher because there's less liquidity in the permits market. And prices are trading at about £85 per tonne at the moment. Could introduce a carbon border tax. This is really interesting. So it's almost like an environmental tariff. The European Union have proposed a new levy or tax on imported carbon intensive products. It's quite interesting, the idea behind it, the idea that you tax imports that come in which have a heavy carbon implication, carbon footprint. Of course, you have to measure the carbon footprint accurately, and you have to be able to enforce this. But it's one way that the European Union is trying to adjust for countries that are importing cheap products, but with a heavy carbon footprint. So those three ones are essentially increasing the costs of producers, internalising the externality. Another option, of course, is to go in a positive way to subsidise or offer subsidies and tax relief for clean energy investments. We've had in the UK, for example, the feed-in tariff scheme, which is where, I put some solar panels on my roof, and generate enough energy for my own use and feed in a bit of extra energy back to the grid and get a payment for doing that. There's all kind of subsidies that you could use, for example, for producers of renewable energy. And I always ask my students this, but can you visualize a subsidy diagram for a producer? Can you see visualize that, what that would look like? If you can, you're in great shape. Regulations are important. So bans, laws, legislation. Really good example is that the government's brought in a ban on new petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. So we're going to have a few years to adjust to that. The European Union is setting tough emissions caps on new cars, for example, the number of CO2 emissions per kilometre travelled. You can set much greater standards on end-of-life directives for household appliances or energy efficiency levels for your freezer or your cooker and so on. So regulations can play a big part. And linked with that, I guess, is the idea of recycling targets. The new plastic packaging tax has come in. Not necessarily an emissions tax, it's a pollution tax. But you can avoid the tax, which I think is £200 per tonne of plastic, if 30% of the plastic is recycled, which is quite interesting. Nationalisation is certainly a possibility. State ownership, huge controversy, enormous distress and anger, really, caused by the thousands of examples of raw sewage, untreated sewage being emitted and dumped into rivers and tributaries and bathing areas, particularly in the south of England, by the privatised water utilities. Some people are saying, well, this cannot go on. The environmental damage is too great, and there might well be a case for nationalisation of these businesses. And of course, we can use behavioural nudges. Nudges, basically, you don't change the financial aspect of a decision, you try to change the choice architecture. You try and change people's defaults of behaviour, trying to use nudges, for example, to increase recycling rates and also to reduce food waste. So loads of possible interventions, and I'm sure that you'll have great examples in your notes. In terms of evaluating intervention, let me just give you some ideas that you might want to think about, particularly in a sort of 15 mark, 25 mark essay style question. First question is the intervention effective? Does it work in achieving its aims? Secondly, is the intervention equitable? Is the intervention, is the tax or subsidy or price intervention fair? Who are the winners and losers? I'll come back to both of these points on separate slides in a second. Does the intervention avoid creating second-order distortions and disincentives? So oftentimes when governments intervene in one way, they create distortions in the market. A subsidy to renewable energy might create a distortion, for example. Or they might create a disincentive for firms to invest or employ people or innovate, but sometimes that can lead to inefficiencies. Does the intervention conflict with other policy objectives? So you might impose a high carbon tax, for example. That increases the cost of domestic producers, certainly in the short term, and that can make them less competitive in overseas markets, with a possible loss of exports and jobs and investment. Crucially, can the market mechanism find better solutions over time? Don't forget, government intervention is obviously, you have to write about it and analyse it. But out there are some super smart people, very driven, often very skilled people operating in markets who find solutions to problems. They develop lighter materials. They're innovative in product design. The market mechanism is often quite powerful in addressing some of these big issues, particularly surrounding climate change. And maybe try and give the market more of an incentive to change over time. And to what extent is a mix of interventions needed? I said before, one policy on its own probably won't work. Okay, key one. Is the policy effective? This is a common question. So to what extent is an intervention effective in achieving its set aims? Well, clearly you're going to bring in the idea of elasticity. And often people say, well, tax doesn't work because demand's elastic, or inelastic, sorry. Well, to be more precise, the tax may not work if the coefficient of price elasticity of demand is low, because people's behaviour, they carry on spending and demanding things even if the price goes up. Don't just use price elasticity, think also about cross-price elasticity. So, for example, if we put a tax on plastic, in theory, that should cause an increase in the demand for recycled plastic. If we put a tax on carbon, it should increase the demand for renewable energy. So those are substitutes. So therefore you need to think about the likely cross-price elasticity of demand. How easy is it to switch between one to the other? And then that links to price elasticity of supply. So the new plastic tax, which is just coming to the UK, will increase the demand for recycled plastic, for sure, and is doing. But how much capacity does the recycled plastic industry have to be able to meet an increase in demand? Has the intervention changed relative prices sufficiently to trigger a change in behaviour? So comment on the magnitude of the intervention. How high is the increase in the carbon tax? How high has the permit system led to an increase in the price of pollution permits? And crucially, this is for top level evaluation. If a policy is deemed to be ineffective, are there better alternatives either in the short run or the long run? So if we think about carbon, if we think about CO2 emissions and climate change, the relative merits and demerits of carbon trading versus carbon taxes versus tougher emission standards. Think about alternatives in your evaluation. Is the intervention efficient? Does the intervention make markets work better, or does it lead to government failure? So in theory, interventions are designed to bring about more allocative efficiency, nudge markets towards a social optimum, encourage firms to achieve economies of scale and innovate. But they don't always do that. So look to see if you think that is the case. And of course, if the market failure intervention leads to an even deeper market failure, then you get government failure. And it comes in several guises, including policies creating disincentives, regulatory capture, and also the law of unintended consequences. Is the intervention equitable? So assess the extent to which an intervention leads to an inequitable outcome. Who are the winners? Who are the losers across different time periods? So a pollution tax, a carbon tax, might bear most heavily on low-income families, particularly if the cost of living rises as we're seeing at the moment. If we offer renewable subsidies, well, who's getting those subsidies and how much are they benefiting? Are governments compensating those who lose out? With a carbon tax, how much revenue is created and who benefits from that? How is the revenue used? These are important evaluation perspectives. Very quickly, let's quickly finish off by the pollution, the tax idea. Let's go back to our negative externalities diagram. So the idea here is that you try and tax the polluter. If you do that, the marginal private cost added to the tax goes up, which in theory takes you to the social optimum point. There's the tax per unit is that vertical distance. So this area here shows the tax revenue that the government gets from a pollution tax. Happy days. If you get the right tax, you get some revenue and the output is at the social optimum level. However, if you want to develop the diagram to talk about government failure, maybe government set the wrong tax. Perhaps they overtax, in which case they might set the tax too high. In this situation, let's go back a slide. So the tax, we've gone a bit higher. At point D, it cuts the marginal private benefit curve now. So price is higher, P4, output's lower. In this situation, we've now squeezed output below the social optimum. And that would be a good example of government failure in the market. So there we go, a revision video looking at the analysis, the application and evaluation of policies to address negative externalities. Thanks for joining in. Take care and see you soon.